Voilà, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I will be sharing my time. Yes, here we are today in the House to debate Bills S7, and before I begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to wish everyone a good Earth Day. I was in Montreal yesterday for Earth Day. There were over 15,000 or 20,000 Montrealers marching for the environmental cause, so it was great to participate in that. The second announcement I'd like to make is that today there were arrests, crimes were prevented, and I'd like to take a few seconds to congratulate the RCMP and the police for their work. They did important work in this regard. So let's get back to Bill S7, which of course has a connection to today's events, and the Conservatives like to say has a link to the tragic events we saw in Boston last week. Mr. Speaker, we have before us in third reading a bill which unfortunately may well threaten the basic civil liberties of Canadians. We have reason to think that. For the NDP, that is extremely important. We have to look at this very seriously. Mr. Speaker, S7 is a controversial bill, and the Conservatives did not present any analysis, evidence, or study that demonstrates, it proves that the measures contained in S7 are necessary, are useful, are relevant. There are many things already in place that allow us to intervene in terrorism or other criminal acts of that nature. These measures were used on many occasions. So, is the content of S7 necessary and relevant? Do we really need new tools to fight terrorism? Well, we have serious doubts about that. If the debate was only about that, perhaps the debate would be very different. What's worrisome here is that not only are we not sure that this bill will have an impact or be useful, but we also have serious reason to believe that it violates the rights of Canadians. And that's the problem. Are we really going to agree to imperil certain fundamental rights for a bill that may not even be useful? We have reason to doubt it. For the NDP, those concerns must be answered very seriously before we go forward with any kind of bill, regardless of the intent behind it or the good cause. As soon as it threatens fundamental rights and freedoms, we have to put a stop to things and make sure that the bill is not a threat to the rights of Canadians.
And that is why we want to intervene, and that is why, unfortunately, the NDP cannot support Bill S7 as it is before us today, with all its flaws and all the doubts that around the terms that I talked about earlier. Mr. Speaker, if the NDP had doubts with regard to this bill, well, it didn't stop there. They didn't say, no, we have doubts. Perhaps my speech doesn't interest everyone, but I would like be able to. I'd like to be able to speak until the end. I would like to thank the Minister for Culture to leave the House, please, so that I can continue. So, as I said a little bit earlier, Mr. Speaker, it is not that the NDP just stopped at the fact that we had doubts. No, we did some serious work on the Public Safety Committee, and there were 18 amendments that were introduced in committee during the debate in order to improve this bill and to ensure that there is no threat to the rights and liberties of Canadians. I bet you can guess what happened, Mr. Speaker. Yes, indeed, all 18 amendments were defeated, were rejected for all different reasons, even though we were trying to improve the bill. And I will put forward two examples of amendments that were made that support what I said earlier. First, one of the amendments proposed the addition of an exhaustive examination of the implementation of the recommendations of the ARAR a topic concerning accountability and monitoring mechanisms by paying special attention to monitoring and activities among agencies. With S7, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about putting in place discretionary powers, and that could mean that someone could be imprisoned for a few days or even a few months with no grounds, with no reason, and that is worrisome. And thanks to the amendment that I just read, the NDP wanted to ensure that people's rights and fundamental freedoms were respected. The amendment was turned down. Another amendment, Mr. Speaker, to include the notice of the Human Rights Commission on the questions regarding racial discrimination and profiling around Bill S7. And in that regard, I would like to talk about the Church of God, a church in my riding with whom I met recently. I met with seniors, parents, and young people. All of them were very dynamic, who told me about a number of issues, but they particularly talked about profiling, their concerns and things that had happened to them regarding profiling that affects the Black community of the West Island. And I want to tell them that I heard them, and that if in this bill we have doubts as to where discretionary power might lead, if it might lead to racial profiling and discrimination, well, the NDP is here to stand up and to put a stop to this kind of thing and to ensure that all bills that are introduced in this House address the concerns of the Black community and the community of the Church of God. I would like to continue, Mr. Speaker, by echoing what something that one of my Conservative colleagues said today about Bill S7. She said that she found that the NDP's position was deplorable, and that one day we would realize that all the work done on this bill, and that all the witnesses that were heard from and who supported this bill, that we would realize our error. Now, I paraphrase, Mr. Speaker, but what I want to respond is that I'm sorry to contradict her, that we're numerous witnesses who are also concerned and who did not agree with Bill S7 in its current form as it is being debated today. And I will quote from two witnesses who appeared before the committee, Mr. Speaker. First, I would like to quote Ms. Avocat. She says, "We are begging you not to increase the powers of national security organizations, provided as long as there is no accountability and examination mechanism that is effective." So we're not talking about a simple opposition here. We're talking about someone who is bringing forward suggestions by saying, if you choose to go in that direction, we are begging you to also put in place some mechanisms that ensure the safety and the preservation of Canadians' rights and freedoms. I would also like to quote, Mr. Speaker, from Paul Calarco, who is a member of the Canadian Bar Association, and he says, "There is no doubt that in order to protect society, it is essential to prevent terrorist acts. To do so, we need effective legislation that respect our legal tradition. Unfortunately, this bill attains neither of these objectives." So just to say, Mr. Speaker, that the NDP is not all alone when it is saying that there are concerns with this bill. There are also experts who share our opinion that this bill in its current form may represent a threat or may not contain effective measures. I will close, Mr. Speaker, by saying that, yes, I repeat that the NDP and myself, we are convinced that we must pay special attention to fighting terrorism. And everyone in this House agrees. But how are we going to wage this fight? And in our opinion, Bill S7 is not the answer because it threatens the fundamental rights and freedoms of Canadians that are dear to Canadians, that we can be proud of, and that must not be flouted. And that means, Mr. Speaker, that by voting against this bill, that we support terrorists? Of course not, Mr. Speaker. That is completely absurd. We must start from the premise that everyone in this House must put forward and implement tools that will help fight terrorism, and Bill S7 is not one of these tools.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to explore a little bit more the comments from the NDP that we don't need this bill, that S7 somehow is already covered, all of the measures are covered here. And I'd just like to ask them, we do have clauses in this bill covering new offences for leaving Canada or attempting to leave Canada for the purpose of committing a terrorism offence or an offence that would be created under proposed amendments. These new offences are aimed at deterring persons who could be planning to receive terrorist training or engage in other terrorist activities abroad. In light of the fact that we've had 2 men from London, Ontario, recently identified as being involved in the gas plant attack in Algeria, which is of significant concern to residents of my riding, a lot of whom travel to various countries to work in the oil and gas industry. I just want to ask the NDP, how can they say that there's nothing new in this bill when clearly it is targeting people and has a very high threshold, which is the intent to commit an offence in this regard?
The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. I would like to thank my colleague, my very respectful colleague, for her question. And I would just like to rectify something. I did not say that in this bill that there was nothing new or that it was a bad bill from beginning to end. What I said is that there is a threat to Canadians' rights and freedoms, and I would like to ask my colleague myself, how far is she willing to go to risk Canadians' rights and freedoms to fight terrorism? There may be things in this bill that are interesting, Mr. Speaker, but the NDP will always oppose a bill that will put Canadians' rights and freedoms at risk. And if Conservatives are serious about fighting terrorism, then why did they diminish resources for cross-border agencies or for the RCMP, people who need these resources to fight crime and to fight violence and terrorism, and unfortunately, who were not supported by Conservatives in its budget?
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member, in concluding her remarks, she made reference that the NDP would like to support effective tools. At the hearing stage of S7, it was made very clear by a number of law enforcement officers and experts indicating that the bill itself, in principle, does provide yet another tool, and this is coming from experts and law enforcement agencies, something in which they believe would in fact assist them in the future in combating terrorism. Now, just because, our officials to date, and Canada's been very fortunate where we have not had acts of terrorism to the same degree at all of other nations, doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't be progressively looking at how we can enhancing our law enforcement abilities in the future in terms of combating it. My question to the member is that given that we have expert and law enforcement agencies themselves, officers saying that this is a tool that they would like to be able to have, why would the NDP want to deny them that right, given that there are checks in place to protect individual rights and freedoms?
The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hear in this House my colleague from the Liberal Party who is going to support Bill S7, but I would have liked to hear him talk about the risk that this bill poses to Canadians' fundamental rights and freedoms. Because if the Liberal Party wants to boast about defending this type of principle, then we certainly can't see it in their support for S7. Are we going to go forward with any kind of bill that could be useful if it threatens the rights and freedoms of Canadians? What we are saying is, why should we rush this bill through? There are still serious doubts, and we need to address those concerns before going forward with a bill like this one.